So next up we have the presentation for the Applied Forest Ecology Award, and this is an award that is for Masters or Honours students, and it's awarded in February and the students then come and present that year. So it's quite a fast turnaround for the students, and I believe the winner of this year is an Honours student. So I'd like to welcome Summer Potvin to the stage and congratulate you on your award.
Thank you.
Oh, and here's your award. Oh, do you need a photo?
Thank you. I would like to begin by paying respect to the traditional owners of the land I performed my fieldwork on, the Muanina people, to pay respect to those that have passed before us and to acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people who are the custodians of this land. So I would also like to thank the City of Hobart as well as the ESA for helping to support and fund this project. So my name is Summer, and today I'll be talking to you about a proportion of my honours project, which was looking at the flammability of fuels in eucalypt forests. So first I'd like to give you a little bit of context about my research. So we're all well aware that we live on a fire-prone continent, and as a result, we have quite severe wildfire behaviour. And this is due to three main reasons, being our imposing human land practices at the wildland-urban interface, as well as our altering climate and our fuel type. And as a result, we've seen quite a severe bushfire history, including the Ash Wednesday fires, as well as the 1967 fires in Tasmania. So I wanted to study fuel flammability to see if this could help predict better wildfire behaviour in the future, as well as to see if we can implement better wildfire management practices like the use of green fire breaks. So first I just want to break down what fuel flammability is. So fuel flammability is made up of four main components. First we have ignitability, which is the time taken for fuel to ignite. Combustibility, which is the rapidity of fire burning. Consumability, which is the proportion of mass burned during combustibility. And sustainability, which is the duration of burning. And these are all measured indirectly through attributes such as time to ignition, maximum flame height, maximum temperature, flame height, rate of flaming combustion, percent combusted, and burn duration. And these were the 6 attributes that I looked at during my research. So plant traits can heavily influence fuel flammability, and this can be broken down into 2 main categories. So first you have plant morphology, and this can look at the plant and leaf length, width, thickness and density, as well as chemical properties such as moisture content, volatile oils, minerals and waxes, as well as chemistry like percent of carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus content. And I focus primarily on the carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus. So percent carbon has been shown to possibly increase flammability due to it influencing the burn duration, while percent nitrogen and phosphorus potentially act as a retardant and actually reduce the likelihood of flammability due to minimizing ignition. So I had 2 primary aims of my study. The first aim was to measure the flammability of common fuels found in predominantly wet eucalypt forests. And my second aim was to determine if chemical traits may be main drivers in plant flammability. So I collected fresh plant samples, predominantly from the understory and canopy of wet eucalypt forests. And you can see here on the slide the 12 main plant species that I collected. Please note that some of these species weren't actually wet eucalypt forest species, And this was because when I actually got to the sites, even though it said on a map it was wet eucalypt forest, a lot of the time they were either transitional or did have some dry eucalypt forest species there. So I chose to go off more what the forest was showing and therefore collect all the plants that were primarily there. So this here is my plant flammability device, also known as my plant barbecue. And I just wanted to break down a little bit of the mechanisms of this plant barbecue. So, as you can see here, there is a grill, and this was used to place the plant material on for the burning. Underneath the grill, there are 3 main burners, and this acted as a pre-warming phase before I actually burnt the plant sample. So what this did was to simulate what actually happens during a wildfire event. Before it gets to those individual species, it has that pre-warming and drying period. I have my blowtorch here, and this acted as a 10-second ignition source to help ignite the plant material. I've got some thermocouples here to measure the temperature within and around the plant sample while it burned. And on the sides and down the bottom, I've got my scale, and this was used to measure the flame height. So as I mentioned, I also looked at the chemical analysis. So I took dry plant samples of the same 12 that I collected earlier, and I analysed them for their carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus. So to analyse the carbon and nitrogen, I did this quite easily with elemental analysis. However, for the phosphorus, there was a few extra steps, and I did this spectrophotometrically using a discrete analysis. So this here is the plant flammability output results. So I did a principal components analysis, and as you can see here, my PC1 output actually accounted for the most variability at 67.76%. And what was interesting with this output was this lovely little cluster here of 3 out of my 6 attributes, which is maximum temperature, percent combusted, and flame height. And these attributes actually help to define which species were most flammable, which are these ones on this side of the PCA. So I took the PC1 output and I made a flammability ranking. So at the top, you have the highest flammable ranking species, and down the bottom, you have the lowest flammable ranking species. This output was quite interesting because it didn't necessarily align with past literature or anecdotal literature. And the highest flammable species was actually the Acacia leprosa, which was quite surprising because down the bottom here is where the eucalypt species were. So with my chemical analysis output, this here is the percent carbon with the ranked flammable species. And on the left is the highest ranked species. And what I expected to see here was that the highest ranked species would have the most amount of carbon. However, as you can see, there's no real relationship on this graph. The next one is the percent nitrogen, and again on the left is the highest ranked species. So here it was expected that the highest ranked would show quite a low amount of nitrogen. However, surprisingly, it showed basically the second highest amount of nitrogen. And again, there was no real relationship. And lastly, the phosphorus, with again the highest ranking on the left. And here, similar to the nitrogen, it was expected that the highest ranked species would show quite a low amount. However, again, it was still quite high with no real relationship. So you're probably thinking, why didn't the eucalypt species show such a high level of flammability? And this could be due to several reasons. So the moisture content in the plant or the plant sample at time of burning could have heavily dictated how flammable the species was, along with leaf morphology. So here I've put up a little picture of the eucalypt leaves that were burnt. And you can see they're quite long, they're quite thick, so this could have played a factor compared to some of the other species that were quite small and thin, as well as the sample density as well. So when I burned, I made sure that all of the plant samples were the same weight and the same length. However, density of the sample may have played a factor. So what does all of this research show, and how can we use it to better understand wildfire behaviour? This shows that flammability is actually quite complex, and no one attribute can be used to define flammability. The output also showed that there was no distinct relationship between the chemical properties and the flammability ranking, that plant morphology may help to dictate or influence flammability, and therefore should be looked at greater in the future, and that moisture content may actually play as a main driver of flammability over some of the other chemical properties. That seasonal and temporal variation may have heavily played a factor, and this to me makes a bit of sense because I had to burn during the winter time, which was not ideal, as well as during the winter time you have a higher moisture content in your plant species. So if I did this experiment again, I would burn, say, at the end of summer, just to be able to compare the moisture contents and if those rankings did change, as well as the difference between burning a fresh sample to a dry sample. So if I, in the future, burn some dry samples, the flammability ranking with the proportions of the chemical properties may have again showed a different relationship. So where can we go with the future of wildfire management? This information is definitely useful to stakeholders such as the council and other fire management industries, and it can be used to help integrate and implement green fire breaks. So we can be using species that we know are of low flammability, or more importantly, have high moisture contents, and we should be integrating more of them into the landscape so that we can reduce the risk and severity of bushfires, as well as removing some of those highly flammable plant species as well. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Summer. That was really interesting. So we've got plenty of time for questions.
So the moisture content would be predominantly found in the leaves. So obviously leaves of plants are one of the sections of the plant that can be most flammable, and within the landscape, if it was an understory plant, can help to actually move the fire from the understory to the canopy, or if it was a eucalypt species, you might get a crown fire. So by integrating plants that have high moisture contents in the leaves into the landscape, you're basically reducing the possibility of that fire spreading both vertically and horizontally.
And the difference between ignition and combustibility, is it better off when we're trying to choose plants at the end, when you were talking about for limiting fire risk? Do you think it would be better to have plants that ignite easily but burn less intensely, or plants that are harder to have that ignition but might, once they get ignited, burn more intensely?
So that's a really, really good question, and I don't necessarily have a straightforward answer to that one. For me, I would say if you had a species that might ignite quite quickly but go out quite quickly, you could potentially minimise the spread of fire in the landscape. I think it would be interesting if there was any modelling to look at what would happen if you maybe used a collection of both. Because some of the plant species, even though they may be ignited quickly and went out quickly, had a very, very high temperature. So there was a native currant that I burnt, and that was a shrub species, and it ignited very, very quickly and within seconds went out. But I think the temperatures were recorded over about 800 degrees. So if that was put in the landscape, it would potentially dry out plants quite quickly that were nearby. And so therefore they might ignite just by drying out, and then, you know, a piece of ash flying over. So I think that's a really interesting question though.